I gang igjen etter pausen. Jeg vil bare starte med å gjøre oppmerksom på at Nyttårskonferansen også er på sosiale medier. Twitter, Facebook og Instagram. Og vår Twitter-strøm den kan følges på twitter.com/skagenfondene eller på hashtag nyttår 2013. Og de tror jeg, ja, på Twitter står der. På Facebook kan dere følge oss på facebook.com/skagenfondene. Og bildene fra konferansen legges ut på Instagram. Og de vil også være tilgjengelige på Twitter. Our next speaker, Marco Papic, joined BCA Research in 2011 as a global strategist. Prior to joining BCA, he was a senior analyst at Stratford, a premier global intelligence agency. His analysis and geopolitical views have been picked up by various media organizations such as Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, and Associated Press. Please join me in welcoming Marco Papic.
Hi. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Happy New Year, everyone. Of course, you should be always careful when you hear a geopolitical risk strategist say Happy New Year, because for me, a happy year is one that's filled with risks and political problems. But that's not really true, which is why the title of my talk is this. Okay. The title of my talk is actually the same every year, but it's risks and opportunities. And the reason there's opportunities in the title is because geopolitics is not just about things blowing up and wars, car bombs, terrorism, and so on. Certainly there is some of that, and I have to deal with that when I talk to my clients. But what I always try to instill in the people I work with is this understanding that geopolitical risk is just like any other risk, which means that it's simply deviation from an expected outcome. So think about financial investment risk. What is it? If you have a certain equity return that you're expecting, the risk to that is deviation from an expected return. Similarly with geopolitics, what I try to emphasize is there are opportunities. And those opportunities are there because the media, mostly the media, overstates risks quite a bit. Let me give you two examples. There was an academic study that looked at reporting of financial issues in the media. And what they found was that negative equity views, negative investment views, were more often quoted in financial press than positive. So bears were quoted more often than the bulls. That's understandable because fear sells. Another example is think about weather forecasts. Weather forecasts and weather forecasters. When weather forecasters tell you that there's a 100% probability that it will rain, third of the time it doesn't rain. Why? Because it's better to be wrong and something positive happens than to be wrong and something negative happens. Right? It's better to be wrong and you're stuck out there with an umbrella looking like an idiot. It's better to leave your clients looking like an idiot, I suppose, than for them to be wet. But this all means that ultimately there's a lot of risk overstatement going on. And the media is very good at this because their job is to sell newspapers, not to ensure that you have a positive return on your investments. And that creates opportunities. It creates opportunities because quite often risks are overstated. And that's the first thing that I like to begin a talk with, because quite a bit of what I will be talking about today are actually overstated risks and not understated risks. At BCA Research, we have several themes, geopolitical themes over the next decade and over the next 12 months. I don't want to spend too much time on the next decade, even though this is cool and exciting to talk about where the world is going to be in 10 years. It's quite obvious that none of us really know. I like to point out to the 1968 book that got a lot of press, Population Bomb. And the authors of the population bomb extrapolated linearly population estimates, birth rates, and so on, and they showed that in the 1970s there would be famines, widespread famines, and population growth would be unsustainable. We don't really know where the world is going to be in 10 years, and I don't want to pretend like I do. I try to simplify my job, and this is one of the mantras of BCA research, give my clients actionable research, something that they can actually trade on. But in terms of the next decade, I think we all agree at my firm that there are two main themes that are going to dominate. One is this idea of hegemonic instability. Charles Kindleberger, who's famous for his book that many of you probably read, Panics and Manias, he also is famous in political science for his concept of hegemonic stability. And the idea behind hegemonic stability is that when there is a country that has preponderance of power, it sets the rules of the game. Academic research proves, mostly for its own favor, but normative perspective. From an investor perspective, you like this because you know what the rules of the game are. Whether they're good or bad, morally speaking, that's a secondary issue. I'm not an expert on that. The problem today is that there is more of a hegemonic instability. It's not that the US is no longer the most powerful country in the world, but it doesn't exactly dominate the setting of the rules of the game. There are spheres of influence by other countries, such as China, Russia, where those rules of the game do not really dominate. And this creates uncertainty because you as investors don't have clarity on where the world is going in geopolitical terms. And in political terms, on the domestic level, the other issue is that there's this elites are losing their legitimacy. This is partly the result of the 2008 recession, which has reduced legitimacy of political, financial, academic elites. But there's another current going on at the same time, which is that we all have access to more information. So if you were somewhat extremist before Google came along, you're probably very extremist today, because you can go on Google and type in 9/11 was an inside job and suddenly realize that there's millions of people in the world who agree with you. And that's another problem. This undermines elite consensus. Now you might argue this is a good thing. Elites have messed up a lot of things in the world. Again, that's a normative, moral judgment. I have no opinion on that. All I know is that we have less certainty where policymakers are going. And from an investment perspective, that's a problem, because we have less information. That's the decade themes that I just want to set my talk with. But I want to spend talking about the next 12 months. That's what this talk is really about. Where is political risk going to be over the next 12 months? We have some themes that I will go through, so I'm not going to mention them at the beginning. But one I want to mention is that 2013 should be the 1 year since the Great Recession in 2008, when policymakers actually provide a tailwind to the markets. We're very used to policymakers messing things up, and the media talking about how Europeans and Americans don't really know what they're doing. In 2013, there's going to be a push away from austerity across a number of countries, G4 in particular. You already see what economic populism is doing to Japan. There's a reflation trade going on there, and that's underpinned by political evolution in the country. In China, you have fiscal stimulus that will probably ramp up as we come closer to the March government transition. So there's a political impetus in China to ensure that the new leadership is presented with economic growth on a silver platter. And in Europe, and I'll talk about this, there's a move away from austerity, which is interesting because there was a great question here when Rajat gave his presentation about where austerity is going. Well, I can assure you that the Commission has already answered your question by allowing countries to now look at their budget deficit from a cyclically adjusted primary view, which means you net out interest payments and you net out cyclical increase in government spending, i.e. automatic stabilizers. And this is happening because ultimately governments cannot sustain policies that create self-inflicted wounds too long. Even though Rajat's point earlier is correct, in the long term this isn't sustainable, and I don't really have a view on that. I'm not a macroeconomist. What I do understand is politically it's very difficult to sustain these sort of policies. And you see across the G4 governments moving away from them. And 2013 will be the year when that provides a tailwind to markets. And it's something my colleague Ian McFarlane, who's going to be talking in the afternoon, will also back up with some macroeconomic views as well. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. I want to talk about overstated and understated risks. And I want to begin with Europe. Europe is a great example of an overstated risk. 3 years ago, when the crisis began, most of my colleagues in the political analysis establishment, especially in the United States of America, were talking about 2012, 2013 as the year when most of you would be conscripted, and there would be wanton violence in the streets of Europe, nationalism would be rampant, and the euro area would be collapsing. To this day, I get questions from clients about the social unrest that's spreading through the periphery. Now, I don't read the Financial Times to do my research. Otherwise, I wouldn't be any good at it. I look at actual empirics, election results, and so on. And what it shows me is that while there is social unrest in the periphery of Europe, certainly, it is not an indication of the society that's collapsing in any way, shape, or form. Italian and Spanish governments are undergoing labor restructuring, labor structure reform. When you do that, what tends to happen is you get strikes. And I'll show you how this was the case even in Germany. Similarly, politically speaking, Euroscepticism isn't on the rise across the continent. Few cases where this is actually the case, such as Finland. Swedish Democrats performed well in the election too. But in the Netherlands, in Germany, even in France, Eurosceptic parties or non-systemic parties, whatever you want to call them, have either performed as well as they have before the euro area crisis or actually worse. In Italy, you have this movement that will probably get about 10–15%, which is interesting. And of course, I'm not looking at Greece, where there's a Great Depression, where I do agree there is considerable move. Now, what is behind this relatively tepid social unrest? Well, I think two things. First of all, there is an elite consensus in Europe that euro area integration is about more than economics, right? It's political. And it's not based on the past, as the media will try to tell you. Things like Cold War, vestige of a Cold War, inertia, German war guilt, or preventing a World War III. It's about the future. It's about Europe in a 21st century where continental-sized markets and powers will dominate, such as Russia, such as China, such as India, Brazil, the US. And there is elite consensus that this is why integration must continue. There's a more simpler explanation as well, which is that the euro area has been considerably beneficial from an economic perspective for Germany. Here I show some charts that show what German GDP growth contribution by exports was before euro area accession and what it has been since euro area accession. So before Germany joined, before the euro, exports contributed nothing to GDP growth in Germany, and since the euro, they've contributed everything to GDP growth. And part of the reason for this is that the German Deutschmark managed to devalue versus its trade competitors, in this case, the Swiss franc, by 20%, which explains to an extent why in this chart here, you see that German population supports the euro area membership at 65% clip to this day. This is very important because they're going to have to pay for most of it. So it's very useful that this is the case. So that's the first thing. There is an elite consensus, and there is also, of course, economic benefit for the country that will ultimately have to pay the burden of this. But there's other reasons that the euro area is not collapsing in an orgy of violence, as some of the press will tell you is happening. And that has to do with the fact that most of the population in core Europe believes that the conditions applied to the aid are stringent enough. So what I want to show you here is poll numbers. Here, Europeans were asked, do you believe that your interests are taken into account, your national interests are being taken into account within the EU? And what you see is that the periphery is saying, of course, no, they're making us cut spending, restructure, we don't want to do this is painful. As you can see, only 20% of the Greeks, well, less than 20% of Greeks, but it's natural. Italians are at 30%. Maybe that little blip there is Mario Draghi's effect. But if you look at core Europe, what you see is that across the core, there has been a rebound in this belief that the interests of Netherlands, Germany, and France are being taken into account. Why? Well, because there is literally blood on the streets of the periphery. I.e., yes, we're giving them money, but they are paying for it quite heavy price. And that's ultimately the point of austerity. I know the IMF doesn't like austerity. I know investors have soured on austerity as well because it doesn't make sense from a Keynesian perspective for everyone to be cutting spending when there's a global recession. This is all very mathematical, and I agree with it. The point of austerity was never, however, to really make their debt sustainable. The point of austerity was political. It was a type of a blood tax, if you will, that core Europe wanted to extract from periphery, a sort of proof that the periphery was willing to undergo pain to stay in the euro area. Now that that evidence has been offered, in terms of structural reforms that, yes, have been watered down, but hey, they're there, and in terms of debt reduction, deficit reductions, austerity can be eased, which I will get to. The other issue is this idea of social unrest. I was in Rome when Financial Times said on the front cover this story that there's tear gas, general strike, chaos, you know, complete disaster. Yes, there was a general strike in Italy. No, there wasn't chaos. They're restructuring their labor laws. They will have strikes. This chart here has a title in my report that says structural reform equals strikes. This here shows you the total hours of lost to labor action in Germany. The first jump in labor action was during the Hartz IV labor reform negotiation phase. The second jump is during the implementation phase, i.e., even Germans strike during structural reform. So think about, for example, the indignance in Spain, right? The youth movement that was protesting that inspired Occupy Wall Street. Have you heard about them much over the past 12 months? Not really. I mean, they're still there and there's still protests. Why haven't you heard about the indignants in Spain? Well, because the indignants in Spain are living a very comfortable life. Unemployed, I agree, but they live with their parents at 60% clip. And their parents are relatively quite wealthy. I mean, we're not talking about North Africa. This is Europe. People are wealthy. They don't want to vote for non-systemic parties because there's still hope that the 90s and the 2000s can return. Now, I do agree that the biggest risk to this view is that we have a recession that goes on for 4 to 5 years. But as you will hear from my colleague Ian McFarlane, that's unlikely to happen. There's likely going to be some return to tepid growth that limits the expansion of unemployment to, you know, Greek levels across the periphery. But I might be wrong. What do I know? I'm not an economist. All I'm saying is that thus far, I'm not impressed with Euroscepticism and social unrest. This is what I was saying about austerity. It's ending. Policy of austerity is pretty much done in Europe. Here I show you the cyclically adjusted primary budget balance. As you can see, everyone seems to be in surplus. You might counter, well, that's a complete accounting gimmick, Marco, and it's irrelevant. I will say I agree, except that Olli Rehn and the Commission is using this accounting gimmick to now justify giving a passing grade to the efforts by Spain and Portugal, in particular, passing grade in terms of their debt consolidation, their deficit consolidation. And the final myth about Europe that I want to talk about very briefly, although it's not that contentious anymore, you will all agree with me, but a year ago you might have scoffed at this view. There is not a shred, not a single chromosome of Bundesbank DNA in the ECB. And that's not by surprise, it's by design. Mario Draghi is not the president of the ECB because of an accident. He's there because Merkel put him there. And Jörg Asmussen is not on the executive board, replacing Jürgen Stark, a notable hawk, by accident. He's there because Merkel wanted him there. In other words, nobody in Europe has any money, except you, of course, the Norwegians. But nobody in Europe has any money. The Germans don't have money. The French don't have money. There's no money. There's no fiscal room. There's no fiscal stimulus like in China. So if you want to do anything about the periphery, if you want to preserve the euro area, as I claim the elite still does, you need to do what the Brits, what the Americans, and what now the Japanese are doing, which is print money and drop it from helicopters. Which is why Angela Merkel and the German government has put in place the type of an ECB that will be accommodative and will protect Europe. So what does this mean for the markets, for your investments? Europe looks great from our perspective in terms of valuation. Our European investment strategist, the BSCA, calls it once-in-a-lifetime buying opportunity. Especially if you consider that the ECB is going to become periphery's central bank. Remember in the early 2000s, it was Germany's central bank because Germany was a sick man of Europe, keeping interest rates relatively low that led to all the bubbles in the periphery. Now the roles are reversed and the bubbles will be in the core. German REITs, real estate, equities in Germany, Netherlands, and so on. And that's our view for the next 12 months. What are the risks to this view? The biggest risk to this view is a French market riot, which we don't see happening over the next 12 months. The markets will not focus on France until Spain and Italy are sequestered from the focus, which can only happen via the OMT application, which I don't suspect the Spanish will actually ask for until potentially after the German elections. The other risk is the Italian political crisis. I think the media focus on Berlusconi is a little tiring. I know he's a very colorful guy, and I'm sure we all want to fantasize to be in his shoes. However, the problem is he's not really the type of mover and shaker. To me, the crisis in Italy will be what happens when the center-left comes to power and what happens when they begin sliding on some of the structural reform, which Bersani will have to do to ensure that the far left in his party does not begin agitating immediately, just like what Hollande did when he became the president. But that's not to me a risk that is regional-wide. One of the most intriguing questions will also be the German elections, but that's more a question for 2014. The likely outcome is a grand coalition, and that means that in 2014, there will have to be a decision made in Germany whether or not to have a referendum to change the constitution, because the German basic law has reached the limit of transferring power to the European region. Now I want to stop there on Europe. You get the point. I have a very sanguine view of Europe. I've had it for a long time. I've told my clients not to bet against Merkel and Draghi. Many of them didn't believe me. They believe me now. And also, I think there are opportunities that will underpin our macroeconomic view as well, which you will hear later in the afternoon. But let's move on to some other risks. And we can get to the Q&A on this a little bit later. The US. The US is a mess. I think understated how much of a mess it is. And there's a reason for that. This here shows you graphically the polarization that's increasing in the US House of Representatives. Pay attention to the x-axis, which shows you the left-right spectrum on the economic issues. And it shows you how votes in the House of Representatives are arrayed by the Republicans and Democrats on this issue. As you can see, it's almost like a cell splitting. The upper left quadrant is 1950s. The one lower right is today. And as you can see, the Republicans and Democrats have moved away from each other on this left-right spectrum. Why? It's a structural reason. It's the way Americans choose their House of Representative parliamentarians. The electoral districts have been redrawn to an extent that out of 435 House seats, only 35 are competitive districts. There's no way to fix this. This will continue. What this means is that every agreement in the US will be made with 5 minutes to midnight. Doesn't mean that there won't be an agreement at the end of the day. It just means that US investors will have to go through this every single time over the next several years. Too bad. What you need to separate is the noise of the media from the reality. So let's think about the deal that was just achieved. What did it do? Sorry. What did the agreement do on the fiscal cliff? The agreement reduced the fiscal drag for 2013 from a potential 3.8% of GDP to about 2% of GDP. This is very important. However, it punted it punted most of the difficult questions, such as what to do about entitlement spending, debt ceiling, and so on, until later on in the year, when the debt ceiling is going to act as a shot clock. Now, over this next period, over this next arrow, there'll be a lot of uncertainty, and the media will obsess and will talk about potentially default of the US. But from a macroeconomic perspective, the next debate has very limited impact on macroeconomic overview of the US. In other words, it doesn't actually impact the fiscal drag in 2013. Now, you might say, well, look, but this is about the future, future debt sustainability of the US. I don't really have a view on that. I think John Malden will talk about that. Sure, it looks terrible. In 2013, it's not going to be an issue. And it's not going to be an issue because there won't be genuine fiscal consolidation in the US without a market riot. And there won't be a market riot in 2013. So in other words, there has to be market pressure for policymakers in the US to actually feel pressured and do something. Americans are no different from Europeans or the Japanese or anyone else. Why would there be foresightful and do something ahead of time? That's very difficult to believe it will happen. But my point is, the noise will be overstating the risk because the most important issue has already reduced fiscal drag. And that's what you should care about. The other issue is that there's a lot of underlying positives in the US. One of them is the shale gas and oil exploration that we looked into and that shows that will decrease imports of energy, especially from what I call geopolitically risky countries. China has already replaced the US as the #1 importer of oil from the Middle East. And the US is increasing its imports from Canada and Mexico, which will probably lead to North American energy independence by 2020. Not US domestic independence, but North American. And this will help with the account deficit, the current account deficit. It will also help the dollar. It will be a positive impact on the dollar. I just want to stress how rare it is for a first world developed country to have this type of a supply side shock. Norway had it, the UK had it, but really it's very rare for it to happen. So even though the politicians don't know what it's doing, the US continues to benefit from its geography and from its circumstances. Okay, that said, let's get into oil. What about the Middle East? I would say that this is another overstated risk. That doesn't mean that it doesn't introduce a geopolitical risk premium on oil prices. However, investors and my clients often ask me about things like Syria and Egypt and so on. My rule of thumb to my clients, and remember, I have every interest, rational self-interest to tell you that things like Syria and Egypt matter so that we can talk about it and I can charge you for these talks. But my rule of thumb to investors and clients is, unless you're actually invested in frontier markets, what do you care about in the Middle East? Two things: production and transportation of oil. That's it. That's it. Egypt, Syria, Arab Spring, it will matter when, Saudi Arabia gets affected. But Syria and Egypt are not that relevant. Clients counter back, well, Marco, what about, Syrian civil war leading to A, to B, to C, to D, to apocalypse? And I say, okay, fine, call me when we're at C. Then we can talk about it. The one thing that I want to say very briefly about Arab Spring, and especially Egypt, is this is Egypt on, I want you to look at the y-axis. It's the religious versus the secular line. Norway is somewhere up there with Sweden, right? In the upper right quadrant, very, very secular, very rational, and very, on the x-axis, doesn't really care about survival because most of your needs are met. And so you can think about self-expression and things like that. If you think about Egypt, this is very, this is political science, academic research, very respected, used quite a lot. This is Engelhardt and Welzel. Egypt is more religious on this line than Saudi Arabia. So what do we expect when the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power? Yes, they will have Sharia law. Oh no, not Sharia law in a Muslim country. Now, from a moral and normative perspective, you may have a problem with that. I have no moral and normative compass. Not when I'm on this stage. When I'm with my family, with my kid, with my wife, maybe I do. But you don't bring me here to teach you about morals and norms because, well, who am I? Certainly not an authority on this. my point is simply this. Muslim Brotherhood is the best thing that can happen to a lot of these countries. They're quite moderate, and Qatar is ensuring, the Emir of Qatar is paying a lot of money to make sure that a lot of these guys stay moderate. In fact, one of my business ideas is to quit BCA research, form a chapter of Muslim Brotherhood in Quebec, and ask Emir of Qatar for some money so I stay moderate. And I'm almost positive it will really work. But let's get to what you really care about here in Norway, which is the price of oil. Two things I want to say about the price of oil. One is that there's a ceiling and a floor applied to it by both the Arab Spring process and the Shia-Sunni conflict. So Saudi Arabia does not want the price of oil to be too high for two reasons. One is permanent destruction of demand, which is pretty rational. The other one is the more oil revenue Iran gets, the more it can play in places like Bahrain, in Syria, potentially in Saudi Arabian eastern provinces where Allah had the humor to put all the Shias and oil in the same place. The other issue is the floor to oil prices, which you also care about, and that's the Arab Spring process. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, as you can see over there, the fiscal break-even for Saudi Arabia is relatively comfortable at $70. But as you can see, for a lot of its other allies, it's quite high, Bahrain. And as you can see on the x-axis, the fiscal break-even for a lot of these countries is increasing as they spend more money on making sure the populations are, happy and not restive. So that's sort of the issue of the floor and the ceiling. And that's what influences from a political perspective. Of course, there's macroeconomic fundamentals, which I would argue are even more important. But what about what you really came here to hear? What about Israel and Iran? On this issue, I've also been very sanguine for quite some time. And I've been sanguine on this issue because Israel does not have the military capability to ensure a high probability success of degrading Iran's nuclear ability. So, a lot of the war rhetoric that comes out of Israel is a diplomatic tool to ensure that the West, particularly Europe, but also America, gets serious about putting pressure on Iran. So when you think about December 2011, when all those op-eds were written in the New York Times about how, for sure Israel was going to attack Iran in mid of 2012, those were probably op-eds co-written with Mossad, and for good reason. It put the kind of heat under America, but especially Europe, to get serious about sanctions. So what's going to happen in this year? This war rhetoric out of Israel is going to increase as we get closer to mid-year. Geopolitical risk premium will rise in oil prices. And the reason this will happen is because there's an election in Iran. And all the candidates right now are in the Ayatollah's camp. They're conservatives, but they're also very rational. They want to negotiate with the US because, yes, they have ideology, they have ideas, but they also want to have the 2014 version of Porsche Cayenne, and it's very difficult to get it when there are sanctions going on. So, I'm being funny here for some humor, but the reality is that Iranians will ultimately negotiate, and the West will negotiate because you can't keep Iran, quite an advanced scientific country, as you can see on this chart, that shows you it's even more, it publishes more scientific journal articles than Denmark and Finland. But the point is you can't keep a country like this from having nuclear capacity. It's just not going to happen. It's ludicrous to even think about it. It's a 1930s era technology. To prevent them from having nuclear capacity, the US would have to carpet bomb Iran into Stone Age, and that's just not going to happen. So most likely scenario is that oil prices will rise as Israel steps up war rhetoric to ensure that the US and Europe negotiate with Iran and don't give in too easily. But from the middle of the year towards the end of the year, investors will begin to realize the negotiations are in earnest, and the new leadership in Tehran is far less willing to use rhetoric because the Ahmadinejad sort of group is out. Okay, so I don't have much time. I think I can get an extra 10 minutes since we started late. Is that okay? Okay, yes. Whole world in 45 minutes is difficult, but we'll get there. All I've spent talking about right now is how I believe a lot of the risks out there are overstated. Probably not what you expected, right? As I said at the beginning, the geopolitical guy is coming to talk. He's here to scare me, so I have to, read his stuff. So thus far I've said that, most things are not looking as bad as they are. But one situation, one region where I do think risks are understated, where I think not enough attention is being paid, and in particular because too much attention is being paid on Europe and the Middle East, is Asia. The first issue I want to say is geopolitical, and then I want to get into politics of China. And we can do Japan in Q&A, or I guess you can come up and we can talk about it later. But geopolitically, this region is going to have increased geopolitical tensions. It's a secular trend. Cyclically speaking, over the next 3 to 6 months, there could be reduction in tensions because both the new leadership in China and the new leadership in Japan will be in power. They'll have less reasons to use nationalist rhetoric. However, that's just a cyclical sort of issue. On a secular trend, this region is going to be far more geopolitically risky, and I believe over the next 10 years, it will replace the Middle East as the source of most geopolitical risk. Part of that is also how much it impacts investors. Again, remember, Middle East, transportation, and production of oil. East Asia, all asset classes, a lot of money, a lot of impact, a lot of global impact, both because of exports and imports. One issue, why is geopolitical risk increasing? Well, first, here I have 2 slides worth of charts. The blue is trade with China, the red is trade with the US. And we looked at total trade between China's neighbors, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, and their trade with China and the US. You know this inherently. You know this in your gut. You know this because you've profited over the last 10 years off of this trade, off of shipping, off of energy, whatever it is. You know the trade with the US has obviously stagnated over the last 8 years, and trade with China has exponentially increased. What's wrong with that? That's great. As an investor, you love this. This is an opportunity to make money. Well, if I'm sitting in the capital of Vietnam and I'm a policymaker, I hate this. Because if I extrapolate linearly that chart, in 10 years I'm going to revert to a tributary status to China I held in the Middle Ages. Think about how China diffused the Spratly Island dispute this May, with the Philippines. It did 2 things. 1, it told its tourists not to go to the Philippines, and 2, it decided to keep banana exports from the Philippines for phytosanitary reasons locked away in the port. And of course they would rot after some time, and then Philippines would lose a lot of money. Philippines had to immediately back off. This is why every single one of these countries over the last 12 months has dramatically increased their military relationship with the US. Every single one of them, even Vietnam, ironically. And this is ongoing, and it will continue to go. And the US is more than willing to geopolitically deleverage out of the Middle East, hand off responsibility for the Middle East to some of its allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, which has its own problems that I'm not going to get into, but you can see what's happening in Syria, where a lot of the rebels funded by Saudi Arabia are not exactly, trying to turn Syria into a Norway. But that's a different issue. The point is, geopolitically, the US is deleveraging out of the Middle East, and it's more than happy to come in and help out its allies to contain China. So when you think about what happened this year, with China getting aggressive against the Philippines and Vietnam in South China Sea over the Spratlys, and later over the Senkaku Islands with Japan, this isn't China becoming more aggressive because it feels more confident about itself, although perhaps that's part of it. It's more the fact that the Chinese leadership feels the noose tightening around it. A new Cold War containment-style strategy being employed in China, in this region. Now, is this negative? Is this completely bad for the region? Does this mean you should just get out? Of course not. There's winners and losers. First of all, unlike in the Cold War, there's considerable trade between these countries, right? The other issue is Japan may lose market share in China, but it doesn't mean that South Korea and Taiwan can't fill in the gap. It simply means that the political assumption that we've had over the last 10 years that Chinese economic rise is geopolitically neutral is over. And I can say that with a high level of conviction. This idea that as China gets richer, everybody is either meh, okay, or actually benefits from it, that is ending. Especially in the region, and especially with China's neighbors. Now, there's another problem that I want to mention very briefly, and that problem is domestic to China. Many of you may have read in the media what's going on in Guangdong. You know, there's this protest against media censorship. Now, whenever you see protests being cited in the newspaper in China, and there are hundreds of protesters, you know, you should take this with a grain of salt. This is China. Hundreds of protesters is not much. Nonetheless, I think it shows, it's evidence of the underlying themes that we at BCA Research have been talking about for some time, which is that if you look at the GDP per capita by provinces, and here black bars are coastal provinces and blue are interior, what comes out very clearly is that in the coastal provinces, GDP per capita is reaching that 8,000, 10,000 level. At that level, South Korea and Taiwan had political reform. That's the first thing. The second issue that becomes clear is that there's two Chinas. There's the coastal China, where policymakers want to have an economic growth model that moves coastal China up the value chain, making more consumption-oriented, escape the middle income trap, as the Chinese government publishes with World Bank all these studies about escaping the middle income trap. This is the economic growth model for the coast. For the interior, the economic growth model is about extending the low-cost manufacturing from the coast and moving it into the interior. Nothing new here. What I just said over the last 30 seconds added no value. China experts will tell me. Everybody knows this. The Chinese policymakers know this. Marco, read the 12th five-year plan. I have. I understand. The Chinese policymakers are completely aware that they have two concurrent parallel economic growth models, one for the coast, one for the interior. All I'm saying, very simple, very, you know, I'm a simple-minded guy. Very simple point is that that's hard to do politically because there's winners and losers when you choose one policy over another. The only country I can think of that had to deal with such a wide difference in economic growth models is the US in the 19th century, although I welcome anyone telling me other examples. But in the US in the 19th century, you had a commodity exporting south that wanted low tariffs, and you had a nascent manufacturing northeast that wanted high tariffs. One of the results of this was the Civil War. I mean, one of the reasons why we had a civil war in the US was that difference in terms of economic growth models. Am I saying there's going to be a civil war in China, the type of wanton warlordism of the post-Sun Yat-sen era, right? The 1920s come back? No, I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that this is difficult to do. So the follow-up question clients usually ask me is, okay, well, they have the policymakers with the capability to do this, right? The Chinese policymakers, they snap their fingers and boom, reform happens. Well, not anymore. Very briefly, I want to look at the incoming leadership, the Politburo Standing Committee, and the two characteristics I like to stress. One, on the left, you see the percent of incoming Politburo Standing Committee, which is the committee that rules China, the percent that have experience as state-owned enterprise managers, and the second chart here shows the background, their educational background. And what you see is that throughout the 80s, 90s, and most of the 2000s, most of these policymakers had backgrounds in engineering, natural sciences, economists. Now, it's a bunch of guys like me. Political science, you know, maybe some history. Now, not to disparage my colleagues, but the point here is that this is not by accident, this is by design. The leaders that are being promoted, the leaders that are being selected are those that are experts at staying in power. They're experts at being communists, right? At being ideologically committed to the party. They're not really doers of the Jiang Zemin generation or of Deng Xiaoping. They're not willing to stick their neck out for reform. So when the media tells me that the incoming Xi generation is full of reformers, this is actually true. One of my colleagues at BCA Research, he worked for the Central Bank of China, he knows some of these people, and he says, yeah, they're very committed to the free market ideals. They're very committed to the idea, theoretically, of reform. The point is that the Chinese transition system, the way they select leaders, emphasizes consensus building and today emphasizes staying in power. This is like the Brezhnev years of the Soviet Union era. These are not leaders willing to stick their neck out, even if they believe in free market and reform and adding GDP growth through reforming the system, you know. Even if they might believe it, they weren't selected to be on the Politburo Standing Committee because they're actually going to do it. And that's a real problem because there's a lot of challenges internal to China going forward. Now I'm going to stop here. I have a lot of slides on Japan and things like that, but I think in the interest of time, in the interest of having a few questions, I will stop.
Thank you, Marco. Questions from the audience?
I will call on people and ask you questions. Okay.
Okay. Seemed like.
Risk of Japan.
Sorry, what was that?
Biggest risk of Japan.
Well, I would say that Japan is an opportunity for political reasons. The risk would be if you bet against yen depreciation, in my political analysis, right? So what I mean by that is that if you don't take seriously that this time in Japan is different. And the reason I want to point that out is this idea, the Japanese old people like deflation, right? When you talk to currency traders, they give you a number of macroeconomic reasons why the yen will not depreciate. Mostly because they've been burned before betting against the yen. So they're very conservative in that way. But when they boil down the reasoning, it usually comes down to this political assumption that Japanese old people like deflation. And that, you know, there's no political pressure to change this. Well, I decided to update this assumption. You know, I talked to some very smart people, much smarter than me, who gave me this assumption, and I said, okay, I don't know enough. I want to look at it. Let me open up this black box. What we found out, at my team and I, what we found out is, first of all, inequality over the last 15 years in Japan has risen by 50% when you look at the Gini coefficient index. During the same time, China has undergone Charles Dickens style industrialization. That's a technical term in political science. And they've only increased their inequality by about 20%. Okay, so a lot of people are losing over the last 10 years in Japan. And why is this? Similar reason that labor reforms in Germany have retained unemployment at the same level, but had reduced the quality of employment. Same thing has happened in Japan. What you see here is percent of total Japanese employment. Blue is regular, red is non-regular. And on the right, what you see is that much more of retirement plans, the red line, are defined contribution rather than defined benefit. In other words, this idea that the Japanese are happy with the last 10 years because they all have a bunch of savers and they love deflation, that is eroding. So the risk in Japan is that you take what Abe is doing and what he's saying about the BOJ, and you don't trust him. Because from my research, what I can conclude is that the Japanese politicians are more than serious, and that this wave of economic populism is truly real, which means that the BOJ is definitely going to catch up with the other central banks. Anything else? Yes, question.
The main problem for our host today has been political development in Brazil. Is Brazil, in your view, likely to go a fairly leftist, nationalistic route, similar to Argentina?
You know, 12 months ago, I would have said no, because Lulalization of Brazil, if you will, worked for the country. This means sort of a center-left approach, pro-business, but with some leftist elements. It's been adopted across the region. Humala in Peru largely has pursued similar policies. So when I talk to my Latin American experts, 12 months ago, they were pretty certain that there was no real risk to what you're saying. But this is actually a case where our clients have been much smarter than we have. And in talking to our clients with exposure to Brazil, what we're getting from them is that, yes, there's actually a considerable turn towards the left, serious left-wing policies by Dilma Rousseff. And the question I can't answer, and I'll be honest about it, is that I'm not certain what's the difference. Why? Because, you know, corruption hasn't really changed over the last 24 months in Brazil. It's been quite terrible, but, you know, it doesn't really make sense that that would be the motivating factor. Inequality has been very high for a very long time, so it's difficult for me to give you the reason why. All indications point out from the ground that yes, we are going towards a far more left-wing Brazil. The question I have is why, and I haven't really found an answer that I'm satisfied to give you today. Anything else?
Okay, thank you, Marco, once again.
Thank you. Welcome. Thanks.
Very good. Then we break for lunch and be back at 12:30.